An elderly black man walked into a shiny car dealership, eyes full of quiet hope. But the salesman's smirk said it all. What's he doing here? With every word, every dismissive glance, the humiliation cut deeper. The salesman thought he was wasting his time, but by the end of the day, the old man would leave everyone stunned and change a life forever. If you believe in the power of kindness and want to hear more stories that inspire, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey of making a difference, one story at a time. The dealership gleamed under the bright morning sun, its glass walls reflecting the pristine line of luxury cars parked neatly outside. Inside, the scent of new leather and freshly brewed coffee mingled with the low hum of voices. It was a place where dreams often met their price tags. An elderly black man stepped inside, his quiet demeanor contrasting sharply with the hustle of salesmen prowling for their next big commission. He paused at the entrance, adjusting the flat cap on his head before strolling slowly along the row of sleek vehicles. His weathered hands brushed lightly against the polished hood of a deep blue sedan, his fingers tracing the smooth lines as if the car itself held memories. He stood there for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly, before moving on to the next. The way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, seemed to unsettle one of the younger salesmen nearby. The man, dressed in a tailored suit that clung to his slim frame, exchanged a knowing smirk with his colleague before stepping forward. "Can I help you, sir?" the salesman asked, his tone syrupy yet edged with condescension. The older man turned to him, his face calm but thoughtful, as if weighing his words. "I was wondering about this one," he said, pointing to a glossy black car parked prominently near the showroom center. His voice was steady, but there was a warmth to it, the kind that comes from years of wisdom. The salesman followed his gesture and let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh. "Ah, the Zenith X9. It's quite a beauty, isn't it? Fully loaded, top of the line. But..." His voice trailed off, his smile tightening as he looked the man up and down. "It's a bit ambitious. Perhaps I could show you something more practical?" The older man didn't flinch, though a faint flicker passed through his eyes, almost as if the words had brushed against something long buried. "I like this one," he replied simply, his gaze returning to the car. "Of course," the salesman said, recovering quickly with a broad, performative grin. "But let me be honest with you, sir. A car like this, it's not just about the purchase price. Maintenance, insurance, they all add up. It's a big commitment. Maybe I can direct you to our certified pre-owned section." For a moment, there was silence. The older man studied the salesman, his head tilting slightly, as if he were trying to decipher something hidden behind the younger man's polished exterior. Then he smiled, a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I appreciate your concern," he said evenly, "but I'll think it over." Without another word, he turned and began walking toward the exit, his steady pace giving no indication of offense or hurry. The salesman watched him go, a smirk creeping back onto his face as he leaned over to his colleague. "Another time waster," he muttered. "These old-timers just come in to gawk, never serious about buying." The older man, now outside, paused at the edge of the parking lot. He glanced back at the dealership, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with the faintest of smiles, he adjusted his cap once more and walked away, leaving the glossy cars and their judgments behind. The afternoon sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the quiet street as the old man strolled toward a modest diner a few blocks away. The faint sound of jazz spilled from its open door, mixing with the aroma of fried food and freshly baked pies. He pushed the door open, a small bell jingling above his head, and stepped inside. The warmth of the place greeted him like an old friend. Faded vinyl booths, scuffed linoleum floors, and walls lined with black and white photographs of the town's history. "Afternoon, Mr. Jenkins," called a cheerful voice from behind the counter. It was Doris, a stout woman with a kind face and a streak of gray in her tightly pinned hair. She waved a dishcloth in his direction. "Afternoon, Doris," he replied, tipping his cap as he slid into his usual booth by the window. She knew better than to bring a menu. Mr. Jenkins always ordered the same thing: black coffee and a slice of apple pie. Within minutes, the steaming cup and warm slice were in front of him, and he gave her a grateful nod. "You're looking thoughtful today," Doris said as she leaned on the counter, wiping her hands. "What's on your mind?" Jenkins took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting out the window. "Stopped by the car dealership this morning," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a faint edge to it, as if the memory was still fresh. Doris raised an eyebrow. "You? Looking for a car? Didn't think you were the flashy type." He chuckled softly, the lines on his face deepening with the motion. "Not for me. Just something I've been meaning to do." She tilted her head, curiosity sparkling in her eyes, but she didn't press further. Mr. Jenkins had a way of speaking in half-truths, leaving the rest to be figured out. Instead, she changed the subject. "Well, I hope they treated you right. Those salesmen can be, pushy." His chuckle faded and his expression turned thoughtful. "Pushy's one word for it," he murmured, his voice quieter now. "But people like that, they only see the surface. What they don't see, well, that's on them." Doris frowned slightly, sensing there was more to the story, but before she could ask, the bell above the door jingled again. A young man in a tattered jacket walked in, his face drawn and tired. He nodded at Jenkins as he passed, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Jenkins watched him for a moment, his eyes narrowing as though he recognized something in the young man. "Doris," he said after a pause, his voice low. "That boy. He's been coming here a lot lately." Doris glanced over her shoulder and sighed. "Yeah, poor thing. Name's Robbie. Former military, I think. Lost his place a few months back. Comes in now and then for coffee, tries to stretch it out as long as he can." "Why?" Jenkins didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to his coffee, his fingers lightly tapping the side of the cup. "No reason," he said finally, though the thoughtful look in his eyes suggested otherwise. The boy, Robbie, caught Jenkins's glance and gave a faint smile before turning back to stare at the counter in silence. Jenkins watched him for a moment longer, the wheels in his mind turning. Then he looked back out the window, the corner of his mouth twitching into a small, resolved smile. Whatever he was planning, it was starting to take shape. The next morning, Mr. Jenkins stood in his small kitchen, the soft hum of a radio filling the space as the aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. He glanced at an old photo pinned to the fridge, a faded picture of a young couple standing proudly beside a modest car. The woman in the photo, his late wife, had a radiant smile that seemed to light up the entire frame. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly over the image. "Still miss you every day, Ruth," he murmured, his voice soft but steady. "I promised I'd do right by people, just like you always wanted." The photo wasn't just a reminder of love lost. It was a symbol of their shared values: kindness, dignity, and the quiet power of giving back. Ruth had been the one who believed that no act of generosity was too small, and her voice echoed in his mind as he folded the paper tucked beside the photo. It was a flyer he had picked up weeks ago from the diner. "Support local veterans. Every small gesture counts." Sliding the flyer into his pocket, he picked up his hat from the counter and left the house, determination marking his every step. By the time he arrived at the dealership, the day was already in full swing. Cars gleamed under the sunlight, and salesmen darted around the lot, each one eager to land their next big sale. The young salesman from yesterday spotted Jenkins almost immediately. His brow furrowed, the flicker of annoyance evident before he quickly masked it with a smile. Straightening his tie, he strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "Back again, sir?" he said, his tone a little too chipper. "Still interested in that Zenith X9, or shall we look at something a bit more manageable?" Jenkins looked him square in the eye, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to see that Zenith again," he said, his voice calm but firm. The salesman hesitated for a split second, clearly weighing whether this would lead to anything profitable. "Of course," he said, gesturing toward the car. "Follow me." As they approached the vehicle, Jenkins ran his hand along the hood, the same deliberate motion as before. The salesman began rattling off the car's features, its horsepower, luxurious interior, advanced technology. But Jenkins barely seemed to hear him. Instead, his focus was on the car itself, as though seeing something far beyond its glossy exterior. "You've got good taste," the salesman said, his voice taking on a practiced enthusiasm. "This one turns heads wherever it goes. Perfect for someone looking to make a statement." Jenkins chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I'm not looking to make a statement," he said. "I'm looking to make a difference." The salesman blinked, confused by the remark. But before he could ask, Jenkins straightened and pulled out a worn leather wallet. "How much is it?" he asked, his tone as casual as if he were asking for the price of a loaf of bread. The salesman faltered, his professional demeanor momentarily cracking. Well, the full price with all the features you're asking for comes to about $75,000, he said, his voice faltering slightly. "But you know, we could work out financing options." "No need," Jenkins interrupted, reaching into his wallet. "I'll pay cash." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The salesman's mouth hung open, his practiced confidence dissolving into stunned disbelief. "You'll pay cash," he repeated, as if the words themselves were foreign. Jenkins nodded, his calm gaze unwavering. "I'll be back this afternoon with the full amount. Make sure the car's ready." Before the salesman could recover enough to respond, Jenkins tipped his hat and walked away, leaving a trail of quiet astonishment in his wake. As he stepped outside into the sunlight, there was a subtle spring in his step. The plan in his mind was clear now, and with every moment it felt more right. The sun hung high in the sky by the time Mr. Jenkins returned to the dealership, a leather briefcase in hand. His steady pace and unassuming demeanor seemed almost out of place among the gleaming cars and bustling sales staff. Inside, the young salesman was standing near the reception desk, speaking animatedly to a colleague. When he spotted Jenkins, his expression froze for a brief moment before he quickly plastered on a polite smile and strode forward. "Ah, Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice now overly cordial. "Good to see you again. Do you still have questions about the Zenith, or are we ready to, discuss payment options?" Jenkins stopped in front of him, setting the briefcase on a nearby counter with a deliberate motion. He clicked it open, revealing neat stacks of cash. The sight of the crisp bills left the salesman momentarily speechless, his eyes widening as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "No questions," Jenkins said simply, lifting his gaze to meet the salesman's stunned expression. $75,000, just like you said. Count it if you need to." The salesman hesitated, his professional facade struggling to keep up. No, that won't be necessary," he stammered. We'll get everything processed right away." As the salesman scurried off to handle the paperwork, Jenkins stood calmly by the counter, his hands resting lightly on the closed briefcase. Other staff members began to notice, whispers spreading quickly. An older manager approached, his demeanor far more composed than the younger salesman's. "Mr. Jenkins," the manager said smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm Mr. Carter, the general manager here. I understand you're purchasing the Zenith. On behalf of the dealership, I'd like to personally thank you for your business." Jenkins shook the man's hand firmly, his expression kind, but unreadable. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I'm not doing this for recognition. Just make sure everything's in order." "Of course," Carter said, nodding respectfully. "We'll have the car prepped and ready for you immediately." Jenkins watched as Carter walked away, his gaze briefly shifting to the young salesman, who was still fumbling with the paperwork. The boy's earlier arrogance had melted away, replaced by a nervous energy that bordered on desperation. Jenkins said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. When the car was finally ready, it was driven around to the front of the dealership, its sleek black body gleaming in the sunlight. Jenkins stepped outside, standing on the curb as the salesman approached with the keys in hand. "Here you are, sir," the salesman said, his tone more subdued now. He held out the keys, but when Jenkins reached for them, the younger man hesitated, glancing up as though searching for some kind of acknowledgement or validation. Jenkins took the keys without a word, his calm gaze meeting the salesman's. After a brief pause, he spoke, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "You never know someone's story just by looking at them," he said, his tone measured. "It's worth remembering." With that, he turned and climbed into the car, the powerful engine purring to life. As he drove away from the dealership, the hum of the motor seemed to match the steady rhythm of his thoughts. This car wasn't for him. It never had been. It was for someone who needed it far more, and the thought of what was to come brought a faint smile to his lips. The plan was unfolding, and it felt right. The sleek black car glided through the streets, its engine purring softly as Mr. Jenkins drove with quiet purpose. The city's familiar sights passed by, the corner store where he'd once bought candy for his granddaughter, the park where he used to take long walks with Ruth. Each landmark seemed to whisper reminders of the life he'd built, a life shaped by hard work, resilience, and a commitment to doing right by others. His thoughts lingered on the young man from the diner, Robbie. The boy's weary face had struck a chord, stirring memories he thought he'd long buried. The way Robbie had clutched that battered photograph, his eyes filled with the same quiet determination that Jenkins had seen in so many young soldiers during his own time in the service. It wasn't something he could forget. Jenkins turned down a quieter street, his destination clear in his mind. He pulled up to a small, run-down parking lot just off the main road. It was the same spot where he'd seen Robbie before, his old car parked in the corner, its windows fogged from the cold. The lot was almost empty now, save for that same battered vehicle. The sight of it made Jenkins pause for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He stepped out of the Zenith, the sound of the door closing echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. Robbie was there, sitting in the driver's seat of his old car, staring down at a piece of paper in his hands. His shoulders were hunched, his face drawn with the weight of whatever news he had just read. Jenkins approached slowly, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. When Robbie finally looked up, his expression shifted from surprise to guarded curiosity. "Mr. Jenkins?" he asked, stepping out of his car. His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken much that day. Jenkins gave a small nod, his face calm but kind. "Afternoon, son," he said. He gestured to the Zenith behind him. "Thought I might find you here." Robbie glanced at the sleek car, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked. Is that yours?" Jenkins chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not for long," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys, holding them out toward Robbie. For a moment, Robbie just stared, as if the gesture were some kind of trick. I don't understand," he stammered. "Why are you—" "Because I've been where you are," Jenkins interrupted gently. His voice carried the weight of experience, each word chosen carefully. "I know what it feels like to think you're at the end of the line. But someone once did something for me that changed everything. Now, it's my turn." Robbie's eyes darted between Jenkins and the car, disbelief etched across his face. You're giving this to me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "That's right," Jenkins said firmly. "It's yours. No strings, no catches. Just take it and use it to get back on your feet." The younger man's eyes glistened as he took a hesitant step forward, his hand reaching out slowly for the keys. When his fingers finally closed around them, he looked up at Jenkins, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know how to thank you." Jenkins placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his grip strong but warm. "You don't have to," he said. "Just promise me you'll keep going, that's thanks enough." Robbie nodded, his throat too tight to speak. For the first time in weeks, he felt the faint flicker of hope stirring within him. Jenkins stepped back, watching as the young man climbed into the Zenith, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the wheel. As the engine roared to life, Robbie looked back at Jenkins, his face a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Jenkins gave him a small wave, his own heart swelling with a quiet sense of purpose. He stood there, watching as Robbie drove off into the distance, the car's sleek silhouette disappearing down the road. For Jenkins, it wasn't just about the car. It was about the reminder that even in the smallest acts of kindness, there was power to change a life. The quiet of the parking lot lingered long after Robbie had driven away. Jenkins stood there for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly in his pockets as he watched the horizon. A faint breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the distant hum of the city. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not pride, but something closer to peace. The zenith was gone, but its purpose had only just begun. Turning back toward his own modest car, Jenkins caught sight of a small group of people who had gathered near the edge of the lot. They weren't there before, perhaps drawn by curiosity or chance. Among them was a middle-aged woman in a worn coat, her expression one of quiet awe, as though she had witnessed something she couldn't quite believe. Beside her stood a man with a camera phone, the device still pointed toward where Robbie had been moments earlier. Jenkins paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he approached. The man with the camera lowered his phone awkwardly, as though caught in the act. "Sorry," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I didn't mean to intrude, but I saw what you just did." Jenkins studied him for a moment, his face calm but unreadable. "And what is it you think you saw?" he asked quietly. The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Kindness," he said simply. "The kind you don't see much of these days." Jenkins tilted his head, considering the words. Then, with a faint smile, he nodded. "Kindness isn't hard to find," he said. "It's just easier to overlook." The woman in the coat stepped forward, her voice hesitant but sincere. "That boy," she said, gesturing toward the street where Robbie had disappeared. "He's been living in that old car for weeks. I've seen him parked here at night. What you did, it'll change his life." Jenkins's smile deepened, but he shook his head gently. "What'll change his life is what he does next," he said. "I just gave him the chance." The small group fell quiet, their admiration for the man before them evident in their eyes. Jenkins, however, seemed uninterested in the attention. He gave them a polite nod before continuing toward his car. As he climbed in and started the engine, he noticed the man with the phone raising it again, capturing the moment as Jenkins pulled away. The ride back home was quiet, the hum of the engine a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The dealership, the car, Robbie. They were all pieces of a larger story, one that wasn't finished yet. Jenkins had always believed that good deeds had a way of rippling outward, touching lives in ways you couldn't predict. And now, as he parked in front of his small house and stepped onto the porch, he couldn't help but wonder how far this ripple would go. He sat down in his favorite chair, the one Ruth used to tease him about for being too worn out. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light across the neighborhood. He leaned back, folding his hands in his lap, and let the quiet envelop him. In the stillness, he thought of Robbie's face, the disbelief, the gratitude, the spark of hope that had replaced the weariness. It reminded him of his own past, of a time when someone had done the same for him. That memory lingered, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, and with it came a sense of purpose that anchored him. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on his face. The zenith was gone, but his work wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The next morning, the faint buzz of his phone pulled Jenkins from his thoughts as he sat at the small kitchen table, sipping his coffee. It rarely rang these days, so the sharp vibration against the wood was an unusual interruption. He glanced at the screen, squinting at the unfamiliar number before answering. "Hello?" His voice carried the calm steadiness of someone who had long ago stopped rushing through life. "Mr. Jenkins?" The voice on the other end was hesitant but polite. "This is Sarah Walsh. I work with the local Veterans Outreach Program. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Jenkins sat up a little straighter, his brow furrowing slightly. "Not at all," he replied. "What can I do for you, Ms. Walsh?" There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling faintly in the background. "Well," she began, "I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way, but I heard about what you did yesterday. For Robbie." Jenkins's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tightening slightly around the coffee mug. "Word travels fast," he said quietly. "It does," she admitted, a note of warmth in her voice. "But in this case, it's a good thing. Robbie came by the center last night. He told us everything. I don't think I've ever seen him so alive. He wanted us to know what you did for him." Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the world was bathed in soft morning light, the kind that made everything feel a little more possible. "I just gave him a nudge," he said. "The rest is up to him." "That nudge meant the world to him," Sarah said firmly. "You gave him more than a car. You gave him a chance to believe in himself again. And it's inspired others too. Some of the other vets heard about it. A few of them started talking about ways they could help each other out. It's like a spark, Mr. Jenkins. You've lit something." Jenkins didn't respond immediately. He took another sip of his coffee, letting her words settle over him. "I appreciate you telling me that," he said finally. "But I'm not looking for recognition." "I know," Sarah replied. "But people like you, who act quietly and without asking for anything in return, you're the kind of person we all need to hear about. It reminds us what's possible." Her words lingered after the call ended, the phone resting silently on the table. Jenkins stared at it for a moment before standing and heading to the small hallway, where a few cherished photographs lined the wall. One caught his attention, a group of young men in uniform, their faces full of life and determination. He found himself staring at the man in the center, his younger self, arms slung around a fellow soldier who had been like a brother to him. "Ruth always said one good deed leads to another," he murmured to himself, running a hand across the frame. Maybe she was right. The thought stayed with him as he grabbed his hat and stepped outside. The crisp morning air carried a hint of promise, and Jenkins felt the familiar pull of purpose. There was still more to be done, and as he walked down the street, he couldn't help but wonder what or who would come next. Later that afternoon, Jenkins found himself back at the diner, the familiar jingle of the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The place was busier than usual, the low hum of conversations blending with the clatter of dishes and the faint strains of jazz on the radio. Doris glanced up from behind the counter, her eyes lighting up as she spotted him. "Well, if it isn't the man of the hour?" she said with a teasing smile. "Thought you might be too busy for us regular folks now that you're famous." Jenkins chuckled softly as he slid into his usual booth by the window. "I don't know what you're talking about, Doris," he said, though his tone carried a hint of amusement. "Oh, don't play coy," she replied, setting a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "Word's been going around about what you did for that boy. Robbie, wasn't it?" Jenkins sighed, shaking his head. "All I did was give him a hand," he said. "Nothing more." Doris raised an eyebrow, leaning on the counter with her hands planted firmly on her hips. "You didn't just give him a hand," she said. "You gave him hope. And if you ask me, that's a whole lot more than most folks would do." Before Jenkins could respond, a voice from the next booth interrupted. "You're Mr. Jenkins." He turned, his gaze landing on a man in his 40s with a rugged appearance, faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and hands that looked like they'd spent years working hard. The man's expression was one of cautious curiosity. "I am," Jenkins replied, his tone steady but inviting. The man nodded as if confirming something to himself. "Name's Daniel," he said, extending a hand. "I'm a buddy of Robbie's from the outreach center. He told me about you." Jenkins shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the quiet strength behind it. "Robbie's a good kid," he said simply. "He just needed a break." Daniel slid into the seat across from Jenkins, his expression serious. "You don't see that kind of kindness much these days," he said. "And it's not just Robbie. What you did, it's got people talking. Some of us at the center have been trying to figure out how to help each other more, but, well, it's hard when you're just trying to get by yourself." Jenkins leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "Helping others doesn't always take much," he said. Sometimes all it takes is showing up. Daniel nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Yeah, I guess you're right, he said. But it's still easier said than done. Most people just look the other way. Jenkins's gaze softened as he studied the man before him. Maybe, he said. But sometimes it just takes one person to show what's possible, and from what I've seen, you've got that in you. Daniel looked down at his hands, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. For a moment, the weight of his thoughts seemed to press heavily on him. Then he looked up, meeting Jenkins's steady gaze. You think so? He asked, his voice quieter now. Jenkins nodded. I know so, he said firmly. You've been where Robbie is. That means you know what it's like, and you know what can help. That's more than most. The words hung between them, a quiet challenge and an encouragement all at once. Daniel sat back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe you're right, he said. Maybe it's time I did something too. Jenkins smiled, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. That's the spirit, he said. You never know how far a small act of kindness can go. As Daniel got up and returned to his table, Jenkins turned back to his coffee, the warmth of the conversation lingering. Around him, the diner bustled on, but in that moment, it felt as though something larger had shifted. One small ripple had grown, and he couldn't help but wonder just how far it would reach. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the streets in hues of amber and gold, Jenkins walked slowly back to his house. His thoughts lingered on the conversation with Daniel. There was a familiar spark in the man's eyes, the same spark he'd seen in Robbie just the day before. It was a reminder that sometimes all people needed was someone to believe in them, even if they didn't believe in themselves yet. The faint hum of a car engine broke his train of thought. He turned to see a sleek black vehicle pulling up to the curb, Robbie's Zenith. Robbie stepped out, his face looking brighter than Jenkins had ever seen it. There was a bounce in his step as he approached, holding a small, folded piece of paper in his hand. Mr. Jenkins, Robbie called, his voice full of energy. I hope I'm not interrupting. Jenkins smiled warmly, adjusting his hat as he turned to face the young man. Not at all, son, he said. What brings you by? Robbie stopped a few feet away, holding out the paper. I wanted to show you this, he said. It's a job offer. Jenkins took the paper, unfolding it carefully. His eyes scanned the text. A position at a local construction company, one that specialized in hiring veterans. The salary wasn't much, but it was a solid start, and more importantly, it was a step toward stability. They saw me driving the car, Robbie explained, his voice brimming with pride. I told them how I got it, and they said they'd give me a shot. Said it shows I've got character. Jenkins nodded slowly, a small smile spreading across his face. That's good news, he said. Real good news. Proud of you, Robbie. Robbie's smile faltered slightly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I wouldn't have gotten here without you, he said, his voice quieter now. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you. Jenkins reached out, placing a firm hand on Robbie's shoulder. You don't owe me anything, he said. What you do with this chance, that's what matters. Just don't waste it. I won't, Robbie said quickly, his voice filled with determination. I promise. Jenkins gave him a reassuring nod, then handed the paper back. Keep me posted, he said. I want to hear how you're doing. Robbie grinned, tucking the paper back into his pocket. I will, he said. And thank you for everything. As Robbie climbed back into the Zenith and drove away, Jenkins stood there for a moment, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. A quiet satisfaction settled over him. Robbie was on his way now, but Jenkins knew the work wasn't done yet. There were others out there, people like Robbie and Daniel, who just needed that same nudge. With a deep breath, Jenkins turned and walked up the steps to his house. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the sound of children playing a few houses down. As he stepped inside, he found himself thinking again about Ruth's words, about how one good deed could ripple outward. And now, he could see it happening. The next morning, Jenkins found himself seated at his small writing desk, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. The desk, though worn and scratched, held a collection of items that told stories of his life: a small photo of Ruth, a stack of letters bound with twine, and an old fountain pen that had seen years of use. Today, that pen was poised above a blank sheet of paper, its tip hovering as Jenkins wrestled with his thoughts. For years, Jenkins had lived a quiet life, doing what he could for those around him but never seeking the spotlight. Yet the events of the past few days had stirred something within him. Robbie's transformation, Daniel's quiet resolve, the whispers at the diner, it all pointed to a simple truth. There was power in small acts of kindness, but even greater power in inspiring others to do the same. The pen finally touched the paper, the ink flowing as Jenkins began to write. His handwriting was neat and deliberate, each word carefully chosen. To whomever may read this, I've learned over the years that life isn't measured by what you take, but by what you give. Sometimes all it takes is a single gesture, a hand extended, a word of encouragement, a moment of understanding, to change the course of someone's life. And when you do that, it doesn't end there. It spreads, reaching places you may never see and touching lives you may never know. If you have the chance to make a difference, take it. Because the world needs more of that. More of us. He paused, rereading the words, then set the pen down with a quiet sigh. It wasn't grand or poetic, but it was honest. It was a message he hoped might resonate with someone, somewhere. Folding the letter carefully, he slipped it into an envelope and tucked it into the drawer of his desk. He didn't have a plan for it yet, but he trusted that the right moment would present itself. The day unfolded slowly, the quiet rhythm of his routine punctuated by small interruptions. A neighbor stopping by to borrow a tool, a mail carrier waving as they passed. Each interaction, no matter how small, reminded Jenkins of the connections that held a community together. By late afternoon, he was back at the diner. This time, the atmosphere felt different. There was a buzz of energy in the air, a sense of anticipation. As he stepped inside, he noticed Daniel sitting at a table with two other men, their heads bent together in conversation. One of them, an older gentleman with a weathered face, looked up and gave Jenkins a nod of recognition. "Mr. Jenkins," Daniel called out, waving him over. "Come join us." Jenkins approached the table, his curiosity piqued. "What's all this about?" he asked, taking a seat. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We've been talking," he said, "about what you said yesterday, about helping each other, and we think it's time we did more." The older man beside him nodded. "You've started something here, Mr. Jenkins," he said. "Robbie told us what you did for him, and it got us thinking. There are so many of us out there, veterans, folks who've fallen on hard times, who just need a little help to get back on their feet. We want to be that help, for each other." Jenkins's gaze swept across their faces, each one filled with a determination that hadn't been there before. "And how do you plan to do that?" he asked. "We don't have all the answers yet," Daniel admitted, "but we're thinking about pooling our skills, helping each other find work, fixing up old cars like the one Robbie had, and passing them on to others who need them. It's a start." Jenkins felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet pride that he didn't try to hide. "Sounds like a good start to me," he said. "What can I do to help?" The three men exchanged glances before the older one spoke. "Just keep being you, Mr. Jenkins," he said. "You're the one who lit the fire. We just need to keep it burning." As the conversation continued, Jenkins felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. The ripple had grown into a wave, and it was only just beginning. The days that followed were a flurry of quiet but determined activity. Jenkins found himself drawn into the efforts of Daniel and the others, offering his wisdom and steady presence as the group began to take shape. What had started as a casual conversation at the diner quickly evolved into something far more organized. Meetings were held in the back room of the local community center, a modest space with folding chairs and a whiteboard that Jenkins had insisted on borrowing from the librarian down the street. At first, it was just Daniel and a handful of others, mostly veterans who had heard about Robbie's story and were inspired to help. But word spread, and soon the group began to grow. Local mechanics, small business owners, and even a few teachers joined in, each bringing their own skills and ideas to the table. The meetings were lively, filled with discussions about how they could support those in need. Jenkins often stayed quiet during these gatherings, his presence more felt than heard. When he did speak, it was always with purpose. Start small, he'd remind them. One step at a time. You don't need to fix everything at once. Despite his humble demeanor, it was clear that Jenkins had become the group's anchor. People looked to him for guidance, not just because of what he'd done for Robbie, but because of who he was. Steady, dependable, and quietly inspiring. One evening, as the meeting was winding down, Daniel approached Jenkins with a thoughtful expression. "We've been talking," he said, lowering his voice, "and we think the group needs a name, something that represents what we're trying to do." Jenkins raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "A name, huh? And what do you have in mind?" Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "We're not sure yet, but we figured you might have some ideas." Jenkins chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Why me?" "Because this whole thing started with you," Daniel said simply. "It feels right." Jenkins didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the whiteboard where someone had scrawled a list of ideas for their next project. At the top of the list was a simple phrase, "Help one, help all." He gestured toward it. "What about that?" he said. "It's not flashy, but it says what needs saying." Daniel followed his gaze and nodded slowly. "Help one, help all," he repeated, the words rolling off his tongue. "I like it." The name stuck, and as the group continued to grow, so did its impact. The first project was modest but meaningful, repairing Robbie's old car and donating it to a single mother who had been walking miles to get to work each day. The second was organizing a small job fair for veterans, hosted at the community center. Each effort was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. Jenkins watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride. He didn't see himself as the leader. He preferred to stay in the background, offering advice when asked but never seeking the spotlight. Yet it was clear that his influence was everywhere, woven into the fabric of what Help One, Help All was becoming. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting, Daniel pulled Jenkins aside. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but earnest, "we wouldn't have any of this without you." Jenkins shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "You give me too much credit," he said. "This was always in you. All I did was show you the way." Daniel smiled, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Maybe," he said, "but I think we all need someone to remind us of what's possible. You're that someone, Mr. Jenkins." Jenkins didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, giving it a firm but gentle squeeze. "Then don't waste it," he said. "Keep going." As he walked home that night, the streets quiet under the glow of the streetlights, Jenkins couldn't help but think of Ruth. He imagined her smiling, her voice echoing in his mind. One good deed leads to another. And now, as he looked around at the world he was helping to shape, he realized just how right she had been. The weeks passed, and the name, Help One, Help All, began to spread beyond their small neighborhood. What started as a modest community effort was slowly becoming a beacon for people who needed a hand or wanted to lend one. Local news outlets caught wind of the group's work, and before long, a reporter showed up at one of their meetings, her notebook and camera in hand. The reporter, a young woman named Clara, was eager but respectful, asking thoughtful questions as she observed the group in action. She focused her attention on the projects, how they identified people in need, how they mobilized volunteers, and how their efforts were transforming lives. But no matter how many people she interviewed, the conversation always circled back to one name: Jenkins. "Everyone keeps mentioning you, Mr. Jenkins," Clara said, approaching him during a break in the meeting. She held her notepad close, her pen poised to jot down his response. They say this all started with you. Jenkins, who had been reviewing a list of project updates, looked up with a faint smile. I just did what anyone would do, he said simply. This group, these people, they're the ones making it happen. Clara tilted her head, studying him with a curious expression. But someone had to start it, she pressed. Someone had to show them what was possible. That's what they all say about you. Jenkins set the paper aside, leaning back in his chair. It's not about me, he said after a moment. It's about the idea, helping one person. That's where it starts. And once you start, you find it doesn't stop. Clara scribbled something in her notebook, her brow furrowing slightly. It's a powerful idea, she said. But why do you think it works? Jenkins thought for a moment, his gaze distant. Because people aren't as different as they think, he said. We've all had hard times. We've all needed someone to believe in us, even when we couldn't believe in ourselves. When you remind people of that, when you show them kindness, it sparks something. And that spark, it catches. Clara's pen slowed, her expression softening as she absorbed his words. That's beautiful, she said quietly. I think people need to hear that. Jenkins gave her a small smile, but his attention was already shifting back to the group, where Daniel and the others were brainstorming their next project. Clara followed his gaze, watching as the team worked together with a sense of purpose that was palpable. The article Clara eventually wrote, titled, The Ripple Effect, How One Act of Kindness Sparked a Movement, was published in the local paper the following week. It featured stories of the people Help One, Help All had helped, Robbie's new job, the single mother with her repaired car, and the veterans who had found steady work through the job fair. At the heart of it all was Jenkins, though Clara had respected his wishes to keep the focus on the group rather than himself. The story caught the attention of more than just the local community. Donations began to trickle in, accompanied by letters from people who were inspired by the work Help One, Help All was doing. Some offered money, others offered their skills, their time, or even old cars that could be refurbished and donated. The ripple was growing, reaching places Jenkins had never expected. Despite the increasing attention, Jenkins remained grounded. He continued to show up to every meeting, always with the same quiet determination. For him, it wasn't about recognition or accolades. It was about the people they were helping, one by one. One evening, as he sat on his porch, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Robbie. Jenkins unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the neatly written words. Mr. Jenkins, I wanted you to be the first to know. I got promoted today. They said I've been doing a good job, and they're giving me more responsibilities. I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for believing in me. I promise I'll keep paying it forward. Robbie. Jenkins read the letter twice, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a reminder of how far one act of kindness could go, and how much further it could still reach. The ripple, he knew, was just beginning. The momentum behind Help One, Help All continued to grow, and with it came challenges Jenkins hadn't anticipated. The influx of attention, while heartening, also brought logistical hurdles. Managing donations, coordinating projects, and ensuring the group stayed true to its mission required a level of organization that none of them had planned for. Daniel, now one of the unofficial leaders of the group, approached Jenkins during a meeting one evening. Mr. Jenkins, Daniel began, his voice carrying a mix of respect and urgency. We need to talk about scaling this thing. The calls, the emails, they're pouring in faster than we can keep up. Jenkins looked up from his notepad, his brow furrowed in thought. What do you have in mind? He asked. We need a central space, Daniel said. Somewhere we can store supplies, host events, and keep everything organized. Right now we're scattered. If this keeps growing, we won't be able to manage it like this. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, considering the suggestion. A central space, he repeated, his voice thoughtful. That's a big step. I know, Daniel admitted, but I think it's the right one. We've got people willing to help, even donate space or materials. We just need your go-ahead." Jenkins rubbed his chin, his gaze distant. It was a significant change, but one that made sense. The group had outgrown its humble beginnings, and if they were going to keep helping people, they needed to evolve. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it, but let's do it right. Start small. Make sure we don't lose sight of why we're doing this." Daniel nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. "You've got it." Within weeks, a local mechanic offered an empty garage space he wasn't using. It was dusty and cluttered with old tools and parts, but to the group, it was perfect. They spent days cleaning it out, repainting the walls, and setting up makeshift shelves and workstations. The space became a hub of activity, buzzing with volunteers eager to contribute. Jenkins, true to form, took on the quiet role of overseer. He moved through the space with a calm presence, offering guidance where needed but never taking credit. His favorite spot was a small corner by the window, where he could sit with his notebook and watch the group work together. One afternoon, as he was reviewing a list of upcoming projects, a young woman approached him. She looked nervous, clutching a folder to her chest. Jenkins recognized her as one of the newer volunteers, a college student who had joined the group after reading Clara's article. "Mr. Jenkins," she said hesitantly, "do you have a moment?" Jenkins set his notebook aside and gestured for her to sit. "Of course," he said. "What's on your mind?" She placed the folder on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been working on something," she said. "A grant application, for funding. I know we haven't talked about it, but I thought, if we had a little more support, we could do even more." Jenkins opened the folder, scanning the neatly typed document inside. It was thorough, well-written, and filled with plans for expanding their efforts. He looked up at the young woman, his expression one of quiet admiration. "This is good work," he said. "Real good. You've put a lot of thought into this." She nodded, her face flushing slightly. "I just want to help," she said. "You've inspired all of us to believe we can make a difference. I figured, why not try?" Jenkins leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've got the right idea," he said. "And if this grant comes through, we'll make sure it's put to good use." Her face lit up with relief and pride, and she thanked him before hurrying off to join the others. Jenkins watched her go, a sense of hope swelling within him. The group was no longer just an idea. It was a movement, fueled by people who believed in its purpose. As the day wound down and the last of the volunteers trickled out, Jenkins sat alone in the quiet garage. The sunlight streaming through the window cast long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, he allowed himself to reflect. The ripple he'd started had become a wave, and now it was carrying others forward. It wasn't just about helping one person anymore. It was about creating a community where everyone could lift each other up. And as Jenkins closed his notebook and headed for the door, he felt a deep certainty that this was only the beginning. The grant application turned out to be a pivotal moment for Help One, Help All. A month after it was submitted, the group received news that the funding had been approved. The funds weren't extravagant, but they were enough to cover essentials, tools, supplies, and even a small stipend for outreach events. The garage transformed from a makeshift hub into a well-organized center of operations, complete with donated furniture and equipment. Jenkins remained a constant presence, his calm leadership guiding the group through this new phase. One day, as the volunteers were bustling about, organizing a shipment of refurbished bicycles for children in need, Daniel approached him with a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Jenkins," Daniel began, a note of excitement in his voice, "we've got an invitation. A local nonprofit wants us to speak at their community event next month. They're calling it a Heroes of the Neighborhood celebration." Jenkins raised an eyebrow, glancing at the clipboard. "Heroes, huh?" he said, his tone tinged with amusement. "I don't know about all that." Daniel laughed. "You're not going to get out of this one," he said. "They specifically asked for you to share your story. They want to know how this all started." Jenkins shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It didn't start with me," he said. It started with Robbie, and everyone else who decided to be part of this. Still, Daniel pressed, "You're the one who showed us the way. People need to hear that." Reluctantly, Jenkins agreed, though he insisted on keeping the focus on the group's collective achievements. Over the next few weeks, he worked with a few volunteers to prepare his remarks. He wanted to keep things simple, just like the idea behind Help One, Help All. A reminder that small actions could lead to big change. When the day of the event arrived, the community center was packed. Families, local leaders, and volunteers filled the room, their faces alight with curiosity and anticipation. Jenkins stood at the edge of the stage, his hands resting lightly on the podium as he scanned the crowd. He recognized Robbie near the front, sitting beside Daniel and the young college student who had written the grant application. Seeing them there gave him the reassurance he needed. As the applause died down, Jenkins cleared his throat and began to speak. "I've never been one for speeches," he started, his voice steady but humble. "But I'll tell you this. I've lived long enough to know that the world can be tough. Life can knock you down, make you feel small, make you believe that what you do doesn't matter. But that's not true. Every action, no matter how small, has the power to ripple outward." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "When I met Robbie, all I did was help him up. That's it. But what he did after, that's what made the difference. And then others saw it, and they wanted to help too. That's what this is about. Not me, not any one person. It's about all of us deciding that we can do something, anything, to make this world a little better." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. "You don't need money or power to make a difference," Jenkins continued. "You just need a willing heart and a little courage. Kindness has a way of spreading. And the best part is, you never know how far it'll go." The room erupted into applause as Jenkins stepped back from the podium. He felt a wave of warmth wash over him, not from the recognition, but from the realization that the message had landed. This wasn't just a celebration of what they'd done. It was an invitation for everyone in the room to be part of it. As he left the stage, dozens of people approached him to shake his hand, each one eager to share their own stories or ask how they could get involved. Among them was a young man who introduced himself as a journalist. "Mr. Jenkins," the man said, "I'd love to do a feature on you and Help One, Help All. People need to know about this." Jenkins smiled, his eyes glinting with quiet humor. "You can write about the group," he said, "but keep the focus where it belongs, on the people we're helping and the people making it happen." The journalist nodded, clearly impressed by Jenkins's humility. As the crowd began to disperse, Jenkins found himself standing beside Robbie, who had a proud smile on his face. "You were great up there," Robbie said. "I think Ruth would have been proud." Jenkins's smile softened at the mention of his late wife. "I like to think so," he said, "but there's still work to do." Robbie nodded, his expression turning serious. "Then let's get to it." As they walked out of the community center together, the evening sky stretching out before them, Jenkins felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The wave had grown larger than he ever imagined, and with each passing day, it was carrying more people forward, and that, he thought, was exactly how it should be. The weeks following the community event felt like a whirlwind. Jenkins was unaccustomed to the attention, but grateful that it brought new energy to Help One, Help All. Volunteers poured in from neighboring towns, some bringing skills, others bringing stories of how the group's message had inspired them to take action in their own communities. One day, as Jenkins sat in his usual corner of the garage, he noticed a young man pacing near the entrance. The man was tall, with a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder and a hesitant look on his face. Jenkins watched him for a moment before standing and walking over. "Can I help you?" Jenkins asked, his voice calm and inviting. The young man stopped pacing and glanced at him, his nervousness evident. "Are you Mr. Jenkins?" he asked. When Jenkins nodded, the man exhaled as though relieved. "I heard about what you're doing here. I wasn't sure if I should come." Jenkins studied him, noting the weariness in his eyes. the way he clutched the strap of his backpack as if it were a lifeline. "You've come this far," Jenkins said gently. "Why not tell me what's on your mind?" The young man hesitated, then shifted his weight awkwardly. "My name's Marcus," he began. "I'm a vet. I got back a year ago, but things haven't been easy. I've been staying at shelters, picking up odd jobs, but it's not enough. I heard about Robbie, about how you helped him, and I thought maybe there's something here for me too." Jenkins's expression softened as he listened. "You've been through a lot," he said, "but the fact that you're here tells me you're ready to take the next step. Let's see what we can do." He led Marcus inside, introducing him to Daniel and a few other volunteers. They quickly got to work, brainstorming ways to help Marcus stabilize his situation. Within hours, they had lined up a temporary room at a nearby veterans shelter and connected him with a local contractor who was looking for reliable workers. As the day wore on, Marcus's guarded demeanor began to fade. By the time he left, his posture was straighter, his eyes brighter. Before stepping out the door, he turned to Jenkins. "I don't know how to thank you," Marcus said, his voice earnest. "You didn't have to help me, but you did." Jenkins smiled, shaking his head. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just remember this feeling, and when you can, pass it on to someone else." The encounter stayed with Jenkins long after Marcus had gone. Each person who walked through their doors was another reminder of why this work mattered. The ripple effect was no longer a theory. It was something he could see and feel every day. That evening, as he sat on his porch, a familiar car pulled up to the curb. It was Robbie, his face lighting up as he stepped out. In his hands was a small box, wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with twine. "I wanted to bring you something," Robbie said, climbing the steps to the porch. "It's not much, but I thought you'd like it." Jenkins took the box, his curiosity piqued. He untied the twine and peeled back the paper, revealing an old wooden model of a car. It was intricately carved, its details lovingly crafted. "I found it at a market," Robbie explained, rubbing the back of his neck. "It reminded me of how this all started, with that car you gave me." Jenkins ran his fingers over the smooth wood, a quiet smile spreading across his face. "It's perfect," he said simply. "Thank you." They sat together on the porch, the quiet evening stretching around them. For a while, neither spoke, content to watch the stars begin to appear in the sky. Finally, Robbie broke the silence. "You ever think about what Ruth would say if she could see all this?" he asked softly. Jenkins's gaze remained on the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "I think she'd say we're on the right track," he replied, "and that there's still more to do." Robbie nodded, a quiet determination in his eyes. "Then we'll keep going." Jenkins turned the model car over in his hands, the weight of it grounding him in the moment. The journey wasn't over, far from it. But as he sat there, surrounded by the echoes of all they had built, he felt ready for whatever came next. As the months turned into years, Help One, Help All became more than just a local effort. It became a movement. Chapters began to spring up in neighboring towns and cities, each inspired by the simplicity of Jenkins's philosophy. Help one person, and that help will ripple outward. News outlets featured their stories, and social media buzzed with videos of their work, from surprise car donations to heartfelt job placement stories. But through it all, Jenkins remained humble, content to stay behind the scenes and let the group flourish without the weight of his name overshadowing it. One day, Daniel approached Jenkins with an envelope in hand. His usual upbeat demeanor was tinged with excitement. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, holding the envelope out, "this came in the mail today. You're not going to believe it." Jenkins raised an eyebrow, taking the envelope and unfolding the letter inside. His eyes scanned the page, his expression unreadable at first. Then a faint smile appeared as he read the words. "Congratulations. You have been nominated for the National Community Impact Award for your work with Help One, Help All." "I didn't know there was such a thing," Jenkins said, handing the letter back to Daniel. "There is," Daniel said, grinning, "and you deserve it." Jenkins shook his head, a mix of gratitude and reluctance in his eyes. "This group isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us." Daniel's grin softened into something more serious. "We know that," he said, "but sometimes people need a face to inspire them. And you're ours." The ceremony was held in a grand hall in the city, with dignitaries and community leaders in attendance. Jenkins reluctantly agreed to go, insisting that the entire group be represented. When his name was called and he stepped onto the stage to accept the award, the applause was thunderous. Jenkins stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He adjusted the microphone and began to speak, his voice steady but heartfelt. "This isn't about me," he said, looking out over the audience. "This is about an idea that anyone, anywhere, can make a difference, no matter how small. What we've done with Help One, Help All isn't extraordinary. It's simple. We saw people who needed help and we helped them, that's it. And what we've learned is that when you help someone, they help someone else, and then it spreads. That's what this award represents. Not one person, but all of us working together to make the world a little better." The applause that followed was deafening, but Jenkins felt a calm sense of peace. He'd said what needed to be said, and now the work could continue. In the years that followed, Jenkins slowly stepped back from his active role in the organization. He was older now, his steps a little slower, his hands a little less steady. But his presence was still a guiding force. Volunteers often stopped by his home for advice, or simply to share updates on the group's progress. He kept the small, carved car Robbie had given him on his desk, a constant reminder of how it had all begun. One sunny afternoon, as Jenkins sat on his porch sipping iced tea and enjoying the quiet, Robbie pulled up in a car, this time one he'd bought with his own hard-earned money. He stepped out, holding a thick folder in his hands. "Mr. Jenkins," Robbie said, climbing the porch steps, "I've got something to show you." Jenkins gestured for him to sit, his curiosity piqued. Robbie opened the folder, revealing a series of documents and photos. "We're expanding," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Help One, Help All is opening its first national office. We're partnering with other nonprofits, veterans organizations, and even local governments. And it's all because of you." Jenkins flipped through the folder, his fingers brushing over the photos of smiling volunteers and families who had been helped. His chest swelled with pride, though his expression remained calm. "You all did this," Jenkins said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "I just gave you a push." Robbie shook his head, smiling. "You did a lot more than that." They sat together for a while, talking about the future of the organization, the lives it had touched, and the ripple effect that was now a wave spanning across communities. One crisp autumn morning, the town gathered at the community center to unveil a plaque dedicated to Jenkins and his contributions to Help One, Help All. He had passed away peacefully a few weeks earlier, surrounded by family and friends, leaving behind a legacy that would continue to grow long after he was gone. The plaque, set in the center of a beautiful garden, read, "In loving memory of Henry Jenkins, a man who believed in the power of kindness and showed us all how one small act could change the world." As the crowd stood in quiet reflection, Robbie stepped forward to say a few words. His voice was steady, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Mr. Jenkins taught us that it doesn't take much to make a difference," Robbie said. "He showed us that kindness isn't just an action. It's a choice, one we can make every single day. And because of him, we've made that choice. We'll keep making it, for as long as we can." The crowd nodded in agreement, their faces filled with determination. Jenkins's ripple had become an unstoppable tide, and as the sun set over the town, it was clear that his legacy would live on in every act of kindness, every life touched, and every heart inspired by his unwavering belief in the power of helping one another. In the end, this story isn't just about one man's act of kindness, it's about the incredible ripple effect of compassion. Mr. Jenkins didn't set out to change the world. He simply helped one person who needed it, and that spark grew into a flame, igniting hope in countless lives. His belief in giving without expecting anything in return reminds us that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small our actions may seem. The world can sometimes feel overwhelming, filled with challenges too big to face alone. But stories like this remind us that change begins with one step, one gesture, and one choice to help someone else. Whether it's lending a hand, offering a kind word, or simply believing in someone, every small act counts. So here's the challenge for you. What will your ripple effect be? What small act of kindness can you start today that could grow into something extraordinary? If stories like this resonate with you, and you want to be inspired by more incredible tales of humanity, kindness, and hope, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Together, let's build a community of people who believe in the power of good and the strength of helping one another. Hit that subscribe button and be part of the ripple effect.